Hey everybody, this video is called Cleansing After Childbirth, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Leviticus. We're going to look at chapter 12, where it's going to talk about the ritual after childbirth, so ceremonial impurity after giving birth to a child. And let me clarify, we're expecting our daughter about in the next 8 weeks or so, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, somewhere around there, end of December, early January, and I promise you I will not be reading this passage to my wife at that point in time. But let's look at Leviticus chapter 12 and verses 1 through 4 starting out. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled." So uncleanness is related to the mother's after birth and not the child. So when we read these verses, we must keep in mind that it wasn't the child that made it unclean, but it was after birth. And customary impurity refers to the mother's monthly menstruation cycle. And boys were to be circumcised on the 8th day, as that's what the law has called for, with the ceremonial uncleanness would last additional 33 days for a total of 40 days of ceremonial impurity after giving birth to a boy. And what we got to be careful of is when we read this passage is not saying children are bad. It's not given a negative view toward the birth of children or childbearing. And in Genesis 1:26, God has commanded man to be fruitful and to multiply. In Psalm 127 verse 3, it says that children are as a gift from the Lord. In Psalm 128 verse 3 says, a woman with many children is considered blessed. So with the other parts of the scriptures, we see that having children is a blessing. And the key to understanding the ceremony is you must understand the concept of original sin. And babies are wonderful and all that, and they're adorable, and I look forward to holding another child in my arms very shortly. But God wanted it to be remembered that with every birth, there's another sinner that's being brought into the world, and the woman here was symbolically responsible for bringing a new sinner into the world. And the time of ceremonial impurity gave the mother a time of rest and seclusion that she would most likely welcome. And we see roughly today, it's increasing now, but it's been very popular after a mother gives birth. If she does work, normally she takes 6 weeks off from work. That's 42 days. And with circumcision, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was incorporated into the law of the Mosaic cleanliness. And I wanted to look at Psalm 58 real quick. I believe it's Psalm 58 that's in my head. So a lot of people, they hate the doctrine of original sin. They don't believe in total depravity and all that. But in Psalm 58 verse 3, this is a Psalm of David. He says, "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies." So King David kept it real because he says that the wicked go estranged from the womb. They come through the womb, and then they go and they're born and they speak lies. And we know that, especially the toddler years, that children are not perfect. You learn real quick in the 2s and 3s that children have a fallen nature just like us. In verse 5 in Leviticus 11 or Leviticus 12, it says, "But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her customary impurity, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days." So, with daughters, mothers were unclean twice as long and as long as 80 days after giving birth. And what that was meant to do was to reflect the stigma on the woman's part of Eve's part of the fall. And the time of impurity was symbolic responsibility of bringing another sinner into the world. And giving birth to girls, a mother brings a sinner into the world who will still bring other sinners into the world. That's why you see the purification time length much longer than boys. It doesn't mean that girls are worse than boys, even though some people might think that, especially in the teenage years. But some see the longer period of time was to allow the mother to focus more on the care and attention to the girl as well. And in verse 6 and 7, "When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to a priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and as a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord, and make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female." So, even though childbirth was an occasion of joy, and sacrifices were required, and they were to impress upon the mind of the parent of the reality of original sin, and that the child had inherited a sinful nature. In verse 8, it says, "And if she is not able to bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one as a burnt offering and the other as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean." So birds rather than livestock indicated a lower economic situation, though one who was in total poverty could even bring flour, as we see in the beginning of the Leviticus book. And God knew that not every family could afford to offer a lamb for sacrifice at the birth of a child. God knew that there were some that were poor, and that all they might be able to offer is a young pigeon or the turtle doves. So to wrap up this chapter here, because I don't want to get in too much trouble on this controversial text, you won't hear this preached on a Sunday morning, I bet. But we look at the ceremonial impurity after giving birth, when a male child is born and when a female child is born. And we see the Abrahamic covenant of circumcision that took place, which was the cutting away of the foreskin on the male. And the reason for circumcision in this part of the world at this time period is because uncircumcised was more likely to carry infectious diseases in its fold. And interestingly, historically, Jewish women have also had the lowest rates of cervical cancer because of the practice of circumcision. And I'm not going to get into, whether you should still circumcise today or not, because people have their own views on it and all that. But the 8th day of this was very significant, and we find that the 8th day is significant in the law of Moses. And I want to go over to Luke chapter 2, verse 21-22. And most of you will be hearing this chapter preached to you in the next few weeks, as we are officially moving toward the Christmas season. And if you're like me, you already got the Christmas music playing and all that. But in Luke chapter 2, verse 21-22, it says, "And when 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. Now when the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. And as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So we see Mary and Joseph follow the 8-day instructions at the birth of Jesus Christ, and they present Jesus as their firstborn to the Lord. And then we see that they offered the birds rather than livestock such as a sheep. So that shows that Mary and Joseph were poor. Jesus was born into a poor family. And I know there's some health and wealth prosperity preachers that claim Jesus was rich, but when you go through the Gospels, I don't see that. So Jesus was born into a poor household. And we looked at the purification rite for cleansing after childbirth, as sacrifice was required. And the sacrifice of atonement held that the woman symbolically was responsible for bringing another sinner into the world. So that's what Leviticus chapter 12 is about. Leviticus chapter 12 is not to discourage childbirth. It's not to say childbirth is bad, but it was symbolic in meaning to show the doctrine of original sin, that a sinner is brought into the world through childbirth. And we looked at the allowances for the poor, and that's going to wrap up this video. We'll see you Friday night as we continue looking at the laws pertaining to how to treat and handle skin diseases, and that's going to be an interesting topic as we pass through chapter 13, because we're in a health public crisis as we speak. So we'll see what the Bible says about a public health crisis back in the Levitical times. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. God bless.